You're listening to This Week in E-Commerce, the Ecom Nation podcast. Dive into the top online retail headlines with your hosts, Paul Waddy and Mal Chia. Let's load up the cart. This Week in E-Commerce, episode 17. I am Mal Chia, flying solo today as Paul Waddy has been struck down with various illnesses which are going around at this time of year. It has been a very big week in e-commerce, as anyone in the industry would know. We are now currently past Black Friday, Cyber Monday, when things can start to, in some ways, return to normal. And it has been a particularly successful period. But before we do get onto that, I just do want to mention that Ecom Nation has won an award recently. So at the Nora Solution Partner Awards last week in Sydney, we had the honor of taking out the Best Retail Marketing Agency Award. This is a fantastic honor, obviously, and also great recognition for the team for an award which we really had our eyes on. And for me anyway, I wasn't really expecting to win, as we were up against some fairly established players. So it was great to be able to take home the award, which is a recognition of our approach of being an agency by retailers for retailers and focusing on the things which e-commerce founders find important to their business, which isn't about necessarily a high ROAS, but it's about generating sales and profit and doing it sustainably as well. So for me, it's a great recognition of the fact that we went in with this approach and we were able to now be recognized for that. So a big shout out to the Ecom Nation team, all our tech partners and clients who have trusted us over the last 2 years to help grow their business and support the Australian e-commerce industry. Now that's out of the way, I do need to make a shout out as well to Black Friday and how well this period was. So reading from the Shopify press release, which reported a $9.3 billion spent globally on Shopify across Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So they're just looking at that 4-day period from Friday to Monday, which saw a 24% increase year on year, which is just an incredible result. Now, the cynic amongst you may say that a lot of this is driven by the fact that Shopify is continuing to grow as well. There are more and more merchants every day who are switching to Shopify, and for very good reason. Shopify is quickly becoming the de facto standard for an e-commerce platform. And this is not just for small business, but it's also coming for the mid-market and enterprise as well. As you see with a lot of the push which Shopify has been making in terms of its feature set, in terms of its platform, in terms of its extensibility and interoperability, you can see the move Shopify are making to become that de facto standard for e-commerce platforms around the world. So that number I feel is only going to grow. But even with that aside, you can sense that there are more people who are investing more and more time into this period now. So it's really no surprise to see that number, $9.3 billion being spent from Friday to Monday globally. And if you look through that, and I know most of our audiences in Australia, the top selling countries were the US, UK, and in number 3 position is Australia, which is quite remarkable, given that the size we are compared to 4 and 5, which is Canada and Germany, how small overall our population is. But to see that we were the 3rd top selling country in that really goes to show how important this period has become for Australian retailers. And I feel it's going to become more and more important. One thing which we've been talking about for quite a while is the fact that in Australia, we have this tendency to want to go earlier and earlier and earlier. Whereas in America, in the US, Black Friday is still very much about Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And that's where a lot of brands over there do see their peak times, on Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And a lot of that is due to the Thanksgiving holiday. Whereas in Australia, we don't have that. So we tend to start our sales earlier. So if you look at where Australia stands, we could even have a higher amount spent over that if you factored in that a lot of our brands actually started their sales 1 to even up to 3 weeks before the day itself on the 24th of November. So this number is going to continue to grow and grow and grow, and I feel that's a good thing in one way. That obviously people are spending more, which is great for merchants, great for retailers around the world. But does it also mean that we then put an outsized importance on Black Friday and making Black Friday such a hyped up and important period that we forget about all other times a year? So while it's wonderful that number grows on one hand, on the other hand, I'm also looking at this with a grain of salt as well, and looking at this from the flip side, which is to say that you shouldn't put all your eggs into the Black Friday basket. Matter of fact, if you don't even need to do Black Friday, then that says a lot about your brand and how healthy your business is. So one thing to keep in mind as we move past this period, I hope everyone listening here had a really successful Black Friday, Cyber Monday, an entire sale period there. And now we can get back to the business of running profitable, sustainable retail stores. Now I'm going to pivot now into another topic, which is a topic of Adore Beauty. One piece of news which came up, and Paul and I do talk a lot about acquisitions and IPOs and things like that, because it's very interesting when you think about, what is the exit plan for a lot of retailers. And I feel it's very important for every brand to actually have an exit plan, to know where do you want to take your brand in the future? Like, how do you intend to get out or continue to stay in the game? Because that tends to inform how you run your business. So on the one hand, if you are looking to maintain a lifestyle business, meaning a business which is just going to cover your lifestyle, in perpetuity, maybe it's something you hand on to the family, things like that, you'll run it in a certain way. You'll put in certain structures in order to be able to retain that control, retain that continuity, I guess, with the business. On the flip side, if your goal is to exit in 5, 10 years or anything like that, you'll run your business very differently. You'll run your books very differently. You'll look at your hiring and your organizational structure very differently, because you have a different objective in that. So what happened last week was that THG, which is the Hutt Group from the UK, attempted a buyout of Adore Beauty. Now, Adore Beauty is one of the darlings of the online retail space, particularly, obviously, the leader in pure play cosmetics and beauty. They back during the pandemic, with a lot of fanfare, went public and had a massive IPO. A lot of people did very well from that. But then since then, as with other brands in that space, a lot of pure play brands have seen their valuations come back down to earth somewhat. So by no means are they, are they shrinking? Matter of fact, Adore Beauty continues to grow year on year. But there's definitely a case here that, that their growth has slowed, and potentially that initial IPO pop was unwarranted. And there's an argument there about, are IPOs even relevant anymore? But we're going to park that for a different day, probably when Paul's back on the podcast. So I do want to talk then about the Hutt Group, THG, which I'm going to refer to, which is a British company, which is a conglomerate of sorts. So they own multiple beauty brands, all in that beauty space. So when they similarly to Adore Beauty, launched their IPO a few years ago, initially with, let me find this number here. So they initially launched, when they went public, with something like a $6 billion valuation. However, since then, their valuation has shrunk a little bit to $1.2 billion, if I'm getting these numbers right. I didn't write my notes particularly accurately. There we go. They originally listed in September of 2020 with a valuation of $7 billion. And now in November 2023, their market cap has shrunk to $1.31 billion. So again, a victim of the very frothy markets we saw back in 2020, 2021. However, by no means are they small. And there's obviously some clear optimism there in terms of what their growth is, because now they're looking to grow. So they own other brands such as Cult Beauty in the UK, and as well as other brands like Look Fantastic and Dermstore, all out of the UK. So this attempt to acquire Adore Beauty shows that they have global ambitions. They're now actually attempting to break into the UK, so the Australian space, but take that vertically integrated model where they have a lot of brands who all kind of do the same things, so they can sort of leverage off each other as well. Similarly, I guess, to what BWX have attempted to do, but then also Culture Kings and their owners, aka in the US, what they're attempting to do with Culture Kings, Princess Polly, and that whole stable of brand. But in this case, they're much more vertically integrated in that they all share roughly the same products and the same brands and the same ethos, etc., rather than trying to get too fractured. So in many respects, it makes a lot of sense. And I think while Adore Beauty rejected this and said that this was undervalued, it also wasn't a clear no that this won't happen. So I expect this one to continue to develop over the next 12 to 18 months, etc. As there is some back and forth negotiation, and there might be, maybe there will be an acquisition one day. But what this says is that this is the future of these big enterprise conglomerates, that it's not so much about a brand IPOing, but it's about how do you actually achieve true scale. And to achieve true scale, you need to figure out how can we actually scale that business? What are those parts of the business which can scale for growth and profitability? And in the case of THG, they've clearly seen that we can run the same business model effectively across multiple stores in multiple countries and have a similar-ish product offering as well, which means that you've got buying power, you've got operational scale, you've got a playbook which can be leveraged globally as well. And you can see how that makes a lot of sense. And when you look at the markets of Australia and the UK, they're the number 2 and 3 as far as Shopify goes in the Black Friday sales over that period. So there's a lot of opportunity there. So I'm expecting that this story will continue to develop and that this is going to become more and more common as brands actually look to consolidate, to actually pick up similar brands who may be touching a niche or maybe touching a market who they don't have access to currently, in order to scale that vertical growth and to scale to get that vertical integration so that they can grow and scale. So watch this space as more of that happens. Now, the final story I do want to touch on today is David Jones, which is a brand which we don't talk about very often. Matter of fact, Paul and I have talked about it, I believe, once or twice in the past, and never in a good light. And that remains the case with economists coming out and saying that David Jones is currently experiencing a perfect storm of dire economic conditions and store closures that it may not be able to weather. Now, I remember when I was growing up, David Jones was the pinnacle. They were considered like the premium and the luxury department store. You went there for the best brands, the best experience, the best staff. It was all about that. So on one hand, there is a fear that this could be a death knell for large-scale Australian department stores with inflation, rising cost of living, poor foot traffic, putting pressure on sales. I actually don't believe that's the case, because as you can see in some other numbers, and you can see with all the D2C brands who are moving gradually into the bricks and mortar space, whether they be LSKD with all their brands, PE Nation with their flagship store, but also with Crop Shop Boutique, who continue to open a lot of different pop-ups around the country. There is definitely a place for bricks and mortar. And if you look at Westfield's numbers, which we reported on a couple of weeks ago, Westfield currently has an extremely high occupation rate, which is fantastic, which is showing that more and more people are there. And you can see in the US as well, in the UK, that people are continuing to flock to those places, to those hubs, those shopping malls, those department stores, because we are craving that in-person experience after COVID. And you can see that in any live experience, whether it be going to sport, whether it be going to a concert. The only one which hasn't recovered is music. Not music. The only one which hasn't recovered is movie theaters. But outside of that, you can see that we are seeking more and more human connection, and people are still going out in droves to these places to be able to interact, to be able to touch and feel product. And it's becoming an important part of building a really robust omnichannel brand, to have that bricks and mortar presence. So why isn't David Jones successful? Why is David Jones faltering? Despite the fact that some may argue this is actually potentially a really great time for them. And Myer, for instance, again, like we reported about a few weeks ago, Myer seemed to be weathering it pretty well and actually on a path for growth. And yes, part of that is to do with their marketplace offering and developing their online presence, but also part of it is to do with the fact that it's about positioning as well. And for David Jones, my strong feeling on this is that they have lost their place in terms of like, what's their positioning in market? When I was going to David Jones's fairly regularly, whether it be, here in Adelaide or when I lived in Sydney or Melbourne, there was a lot of reason to go there. They had a lot of great brands there. They had a lot of exclusive brands. You knew you were going to get really great service. And the stores also looked immaculate. But over the last decade, that investment has gone away, and David Jones is no longer seen as the premier premium luxury destination in Australia. They slowly lost that positioning and have been happy to, as they continue to focus more, as they went to focus more on middle of the road, to go more to become like everyone else. And as we know, that middle position is extremely dangerous. You do not want to be in the middle because that's where you get squeezed. That's where people don't see the value of you and you become easily substitutable. And that's what's happening to David Jones. So they need to move out of that. Like a lot of brands, you've got to figure out which position do you want to be. Do you want to be in terms of value, providing value because of cost, providing value because of the customer experience and the product experience with that? Because if you try to be in the middle, you end up appealing to no one and you become easily substitutable. And you see this time and time again with a lot of different verticals. In the activewear space, is one where a lot of the brands who do play in the middle are very easily substitutable. And they're the ones who have to go super hard during Black Friday because people don't know which one to choose because they're all roughly the same. Whereas when you compare them to a brand like, let's say, Lululemon or Vuori, who don't go on sale, who do maintain that premium offering and can price themselves with that price premium, they don't need to play in that. People see the value in them. People are willing to pay extra to purchase their product, unless you're in the middle, in which case you are very reliant on those discounts to help convince someone why they should buy from your brand versus the very similar competitor's brand who may just be using a different influencer and different types of marketing and maybe touching on a different customer. Where that value is harder to see, people are more price elastic. They're more willing to actually, they want that price discount before they'll choose to buy you. But if you do choose to play at that higher end, the more premium end, and really focus on experience, people you'll find can see the value in that. If it's something which is valuable to them, whether it be the product quality or the service or the access to brands they couldn't normally access, that has a position there which is appealing, and you can charge a premium for that because people will see the value in that. So we'll see what happens with David Jones. Louise Grimmer, who I'm quoting in this article here, who's a retail marketing expert, she is the one who's predicting that this could be a perfect storm for David Jones. But she also says as well that David Jones, like other department stores, have a road back to reviving themselves towards getting back to basics, and can be like a phoenix from an ashes because this whole thing's cyclical. We'll see how that plays out. David Jones, I feel, is one of those brands which is potentially too big to fail. Someone will pick it up, someone will revive it. There is still a lot of brand equity in that. Whether they need to course correct and really shrink down, revise their offering, and then build back up, who knows? That'll probably be my suggestion. Really just like narrowing back down, getting the costs under control, and then focus more on what's that secret sauce, what's that thing which they can lean on, which they're going to be famous for again, and then growing back up from there. So we'll see what happens. So that's all we've got time for. Hopefully next week, Paul will be back with us and we'll be back in the land of the living. In the meantime, get ready for your Christmas holiday period. Big tip, if you're not looking at it already, look at running some gifting campaigns, or potentially looking at releasing some new products if you haven't already. That's my advice to a lot of retailers at the moment, to look at what can you do right now to provide a bit of newness, whether it be through focusing on, like I said, a gifting campaign or releasing some new products. Either one of those strategies is probably just an easy one, which I think you'll probably see a lot as well. But also don't bet on having a too big Christmas period, I'd imagine, particularly with Shopify's results and announcing how much money has been spent over this period. We are going to see some amazing results coming out from all sorts of the sector, whether it be their NRA, the ARA. They're all going to come out with great numbers showing how much was spent over the retail period. But I'm predicting, as we've seen last year and the year before, that all we're doing is really bringing forward a lot of revenue. So the money which would have been spent in December is going to be brought forward. So don't get seduced too much by your numbers. Don't think that if you go into it I would probably go into a little bit more conservatively going into December, and just be a little bit cautious in terms of how hard you want to push over this period, because we already know that January and February is going to be pretty soft. So let's prepare for that and make sure we are operationally fit, make sure that we've still got good product and we're not just discounting for the sake of hitting a revenue target, but really focusing on what do we need to do to plan for next year. And ideally, let's just run 2 sales next year. As Paul said in a recent post as well, let's just run Black Friday and maybe let's run a mid-year sale. If you can get away with doing that, you're running a really good business. That's all we've got time for. Thanks for listening. Give us 5 stars on Shopify give us 5 stars on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and we'll be back with you next week.